Imagine a room. It is the middle of the night, November 1907. Inside a private library in Manhattan, the wealthiest bankers in America are locked in. Literally locked in. The man standing by the door has the key in his pocket. He is 70 years old, suffers from terrible health, and his nose is disfigured by a rare skin disease. But the men in that room are terrified of him. He informs them that no one is leaving until they agree to place $25 million of their personal fortunes on the table to save the United States Treasury from total collapse. This is not a scene from a movie. This actually happened. The man was J.P. Morgan, and for a brief window in history, he did not merely work on Wall Street, he was Wall Street. He acted as the central bank of the United States before the Federal Reserve existed. He bought and sold railroads as if they were playing cards. He created the first billion-dollar corporation and single-handedly bailed out the nation's financial system, twice. But how does one individual acquire enough leverage to treat the US president like a junior employee? Was he a financial genius or a ruthless monopolist who rigged the game? To understand the answer, we must look past the black and white photos in the history books. We have to examine the hidden mechanics of power. Because Pierpont Morgan did not just make money, he invented the modern concept of corporate control. And the system he built, we are still living in it today. This is the story of the man who owned America. To understand the Titan of Wall Street, you first have to understand that he was not a, quote, zero in the way we view tech billionaires today. He did not start in a garage. He started in a vault. Born in 1837, John Pierpont was the son of Junius Spencer Morgan, a giant of banking who operated out of London. And this is the first crucial detail that most people miss. In the mid-19th century, America was not the world's bank. It was an, quote, emerging market. It was the Wild West. Britain was the superpower holding the capital, and the United States was the risky startup desperate for cash. Junius was the bridge. He channeled British gold into American industries, and he raised his son not merely to be a banker, but to be a sovereign. However, there was a problem. The young Pierpont was sickly. He suffered from seizures, scarlet fever, and rheumatic fever. He spent vast portions of his childhood alone, isolated in foreign boarding schools or recovering on remote islands in the Azores. While other children were playing, the boy was reading balance sheets and playing solitaire. This isolation is vital to his character arc. It taught him to be detached, to view systems from the outside. He developed a cold, mathematical perspective of the world. He did not see people, he saw assets and liabilities. When he finally entered the workforce in New York in the late 1850s, he possessed an unfair advantage that no one else could match. He held a direct line to London. While American financiers were scrambling for liquidity, Pierpont had the backing of the British Empire. But here is where the narrative shifts. Many wealthy heirs squander their inheritance. This one did not. He used it to exploit the chaos of a nation at war with itself. The year is 1861. The American Civil War breaks out. The country is tearing itself apart. Blood is being spilled at Bull Run and Antietam. But on Wall Street, the conflict was just another market variable. Pierpont was 24 years old. He could have enlisted. In fact, the Conscription Act of 1863 required able-bodied men to fight. However, the law contained a loophole. One could pay $300 to hire a substitute. So, the young banker paid a man to go die in his place. He called him the other Pierpont Morgan. While the other Pierpont was marching into cannon fire, the real one was about to execute one of the most controversial deals in military history. It is known as the Hall Carbine Affair. Here is how it worked. The Union Army was desperate for weapons. A contact approached the financier with a tip. The military had 5,000 old rifles sitting in an armory in New York. They were selling them as obsolete for just $3.50 each. The banker financed the purchase. Then, his partner had the rifles rifled, a minor modification, and immediately sold them back to the same Army general in St. Louis. The price? $22 each. In a matter of weeks, they acquired guns from federal stockpiles for peanuts and sold them back to the War Department for a nearly 600% markup. Now, consider that for a moment. The soldiers on the front lines, potentially including the man hired to replace him, were fighting with weapons the financier had price gouged the Union to provide. A congressional committee later investigated the transaction. The report was scathing, stating that the men involved were worse than traitors. But legally, the tycoon was untouchable. He had simply provided the financing. He was the middleman. This brings us to the first major lesson of his rise. In a chaotic system, the person who controls the flow of capital controls the outcome. He did not care about the North or the South. He cared about the spread. But the Civil War was merely the warm-up act. The real game was about to begin, and it involved the most important technology of the 19th century, the railroads. If you want to understand the modern internet market, you have to look at the railroads of the 1870s. It was the exact same dynamic. Massive hype, massive overinvestment, and brutal cutthroat competition. Railroad companies were building duplicate tracks right next to each other. They were slashing ticket prices to zero just to drive competitors out of business. It was a race to the bottom. Profitability was being destroyed by rivalry. To a free market capitalist, this is how the system works. Competition lowers prices for the consumer. But J.P. Morgan hated competition. He called it ruinous. He looked at this chaos and saw inefficiency. Why have two train lines when you could have one profitable operation? This is the moment the banker invented a strategy that would change capitalism forever. It was called Morganization. The process was brutal and effective. The Titan would target a bankrupt railroad. He would offer to bail them out, but only on his terms. First, he would fire the management. Second, he would halt the price wars. Third, and most importantly, he would force the railroad to create a voting trust. This was the master key. A voting trust meant that while the shareholders still owned the stock, they surrendered their voting rights to a board of trustees. And guess who sat at the head of that board? The man from New York. He applied this tactic to the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad. He did it to the Chesapeake and Ohio. He did it to the Northern Pacific. By the 1890s, Pierpont did not just own shares. He controlled the boards of directors of 1/6 of America's railway system. He was the referee who stepped into the boxing ring, stopped the fight, and declared himself the winner. But here's where it gets interesting. This was not solely about money. It was about order. The financier genuinely believed that competition was wasteful and that a centralized, commanded market run by __for_ was superior for everyone. It was an aristocracy of money, and his power was about to go global. In 1895, the United States Treasury ran out of gold. It sounds impossible today, but back then, the dollar was backed by physical bullion. If the reserves dropped below $100 million, the entire financial structure would panic. Investors would dump the dollar, and Washington would default. In early 1895, the reserve hit dangerously low levels. The president, Grover Cleveland, was paralyzed. Congress refused to act. The ship was sinking. So, J.P. Morgan boarded a train to the Capitol. He sat in the White House while the president ignored him. The banker waited. He played solitaire in his mind. Finally, the president agreed to see him. Cleveland insisted the state could sell public bonds to raise the funds. The financier looked at the president and dropped a bombshell. He told him that he knew something the commander-in-chief did not. There was a $10 million draft being presented against the Treasury that afternoon. By 3 p.m., the federal government would be bankrupt. The room went silent. The president realized he had lost control. The visitor then made his offer. He, along with the Rothschilds in Europe, would purchase $60 million worth of U.S. bonds in exchange for gold. They would use their personal reputation to stop the bullion from flowing out of the country. Think about the leverage here. A private citizen was negotiating the solvency of the nation. The president agreed. The deal was signed. The bankers saved the fiscal system. But he did not do it for charity. The public was outraged. They saw a secret backroom deal where a financier profited from the nation's distress. Rumors swirled about how much profit was made. When asked later, he simply said, "I saved the government." But this bailout cemented his status. He was now the Jupiter of Wall Street. He floated above the laws of mere mortals. With this godlike status, he set his sights on the biggest prize of all: steel. At the turn of the century, steel was the backbone of the industrial world. And the king of that industry was Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was a different breed, a scrapper, a fighter, a man who built his empire from the dirt up. The Titan wanted to consolidate the steel sector just like he had the railroads. But Carnegie was in the way. The story of how the buyout occurred is legendary for its simplicity. The banker refused to negotiate. He simply asked Carnegie's right-hand man, Charles Schwab, to inquire about the price. Carnegie scribbled a number on a piece of paper: $480 million. That is roughly the equivalent of $15 billion today, but in the context of the era, it was an astronomical sum. It was more than the entire federal budget. Schwab took the paper to the financier. The buyer looked at it, did not blink, and said, quote, "0. Later, Carnegie told him, quote, "1. The reply came, quote, "2. With that purchase, Carnegie Steel was merged with other holdings to create U.S. Steel. It was the first corporation in the world valued at over $1 billion. It employed 168,000 people. It was larger than the U.S. Army. At this point, J.P. Morgan was no longer just a banker. He was the architect of the American landscape. He controlled the railroads that moved the goods, the steel that built the cities, the coal that powered the factories, and the banks that financed it all. But extreme power creates extreme vulnerability, and the higher you climb, the thinner the air gets. The year is 1907. This is the turning point, the moment where the Titan's power reached its absolute zenith, and simultaneously, where the seeds of his destruction were sown. The Panic of 1907 began with a failed attempt by speculators to corner the copper market. When the scheme collapsed, it triggered a run on the banks, specifically the Knickerbocker Trust Company. In the early 1900s, there was no FDIC insurance. If a bank failed, your capital was gone. So when people heard an institution was in trouble, they lined up around the block to withdraw their cash. It was a contagion. The Knickerbocker failed. Then the Trust Company of America started to wobble. The New York Stock Exchange was crashing. Brokerage firms were closing. Whatever structure existed in American commerce was crumbling. And again, there was no Federal Reserve to print funds. There was only Pierpont. The Secretary of the Treasury, George Cortelyou, literally flew to New York to meet with the financier. Washington brought $25 million in cash, but they lacked the knowledge of where to deploy it. They handed it to the banker and said, "You decide." Imagine that today. The Treasury Secretary handing a suitcase of cash to a private CEO and asking him to fix the crisis. The tycoon established a command center in his library on 36th Street. He summoned the presidents of the major trust companies. These were men who hated each other, competitors who would gladly watch one another fail. The host told them they had to pool their cash to bail out the weaker banks. They refused. They argued. They stalled. This brings us back to the locked room. The old man had enough. He walked into the library where the executives were arguing, locked the heavy brass doors, and placed the key in his pocket. He sat down at a card table and resumed playing solitaire. He declared that nobody was leaving until they signed the agreement to bail out the system. The most powerful men in America were trapped. The air grew thick with cigar smoke. The tension was unbearable. Finally, at 4:45 in the morning, the leader of the trust companies cracked. He walked over to the table and signed the paper. The others followed. The doors were unlocked. The economy had been saved for the second time. But this time, the reaction was different. In 1895, people were suspicious. In 1907, they were terrified. The American public looked at what happened and realized a frightening truth. The entire safety of the nation's prosperity depended on the health and judgment of one elderly man. What if he had not been there? What if he had decided to let it burn? The quote, 4 of 1907, backfired. It proved that the system was broken. It demonstrated that the concentration of power had gone too far. Politicians began to circle. The mood in the country shifted from admiration to resentment. Terms like quote 5 began to appear in newspapers. The idea was that a small cabal of financiers on Wall Street controlled the fate of every farmer, shopkeeper, and worker in the land. And at the center of that spider web was the nose of J.P. Morgan. In 1912, Congress launched the Pujo Committee hearings. The goal was to investigate the quote, _6 _. The Titan was subpoenaed to testify. This was the showdown. Washington versus Wall Street. The old lion walked into the hearing room surrounded by photographers. His health was failing, but he remained defiant. The committee counsel, Samuel Untermeyer, grilled him. He tried to get the witness to admit that he held too much power, that he controlled credit and therefore controlled the country. There is a famous exchange from the transcript that reveals everything about the financier's worldview. Untermeyer asked, "Is not commercial credit based primarily upon fortune or property?" The witness replied, "No, sir. The first thing is character." Untermeyer, "Before capital or property?" Response, "Before funds or anything else. Cash cannot buy it. A man I do not trust could not get revenue from me on all the bonds in Christendom." Pierpont truly believed this. He believed that he ruled not because he was greedy, but because he was moral. He viewed himself as the guardian of commerce. He failed to see that to the rest of the world, he looked like a tyrant. He testified that he did not control anything. He said, "I do not control a single railroad." Technically, he was right. He did not own 51% of the stock, but he controlled the boards. He controlled the credit lines. It was a semantic defense that fooled no one. The hearings broke him. For a man who valued privacy and dignity above all else, being dragged through the mud by politicians was humiliating. He returned to New York, exhausted. There is a strange footnote to this life that occurred just months before these hearings. The tycoon owned the International Mercantile Marine Company. This entity owned the White Star Line. And the White Star Line had just built a new, unsinkable ship, the Titanic. J.P. Morgan had a private suite specially built for him on the vessel. He was scheduled to be on the maiden voyage in April 1912, but at the last minute, he canceled. He stayed in France to enjoy the spa treatments and acquire art. If he had been on that ship, history would be very different. Instead, he lived to face the Pujo hearings. But he did not live long after. On March 31st, 1913, just a few months after testifying, the Jupiter of Wall Street died in his sleep in Rome. When the news hit New York, the financial district stopped. The flags were flown at half-mast. The stock market did not crash. It went silent. But the real legacy of this man isn't his death. It is what happened immediately after. The politicians and the public looked at the void he left behind and panicked. They realized they could not rely on a, quote, 5 anymore. They needed a system. In December 1913, 9 months after the funeral, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. The United States finally obtained a central bank. The irony is profound. The Federal Reserve was created specifically to prevent another J.P. Morgan from ever existing. It was designed to take the power out of the hands of private bankers and place it into the hands of the state. But if you look closely at the structure of the Fed, who runs it? It is a mix of public appointees and private bankers. The regional Fed banks are owned by the commercial institutions in their district. In a way, the Titan did not lose. His system simply got institutionalized. So, what is the lesson here? We tend to look at business history as a story of avarice. And sure, the financier liked wealth. He lived in palaces, owned yachts, and collected art worth millions. But greed is too simple an explanation. Pierpont was driven by a desire for control. He looked at the chaos of democracy, the messy competition, the panic, the inefficiency, and he hated it. He wanted to impose order. He proved that in a capitalist structure, the person with the gold makes the rules. But he also proved that when one person makes all the rules, the foundation becomes fragile. Today, we look at companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, or tech giants like Google and Amazon. We talk about their, quote, 6 differently. We worry about their influence over our lives. But compare them to the man from the library. Does Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, have the power to lock the Treasury Secretary in a room and refuse to let him out? Can Jeff Bezos single-handedly bail out the federal government? J.P. Morgan was a creature of a specific time, an era before regulations, before the Fed, before the safety nets. He was the bridge between the amateur commerce of the 19th century and the industrial superpower of the 20th. He showed us the absolute limit of what one individual can achieve. He financed America. He saved it. And in doing so, he scared the country so much that we changed the rules forever to ensure there would never be another him. But as we watch banks fail in the 21st century, and we watch the Federal Reserve step in to bail them out, you have to wonder, did we really get rid of the, quote, 7 way of doing things? Or did we just replace the man in the library with a committee in Washington? The name on the door has changed, but the game remains exactly the same. If you found this story fascinating, you're going to want to watch the next video. We dive into the rival that the Titan couldn't crush, the man who built the oil industry and